Wow. Throughout this talk, you have heard whistling as an underlying motif. The whistle tones of mobile phones, handies, the whistles that sent men up over into no man's land, those factory steam whistles that, announcing the silence of Armistice Day, whistled shell-shock men back into the storm of battle. The whistling of bullets, which were especially remarkable once rifled guns were introduced during the Crimean War. The distressed whistling of tinnitus and wolf whistles. Again and again, I find that whistling as a primal calling out, calling to, calling for, prompts my agenda for research into the history of emergency, most acutely through the trajectory of that odd phrase to which I have finally arrived, whistling up a storm. Sailors, becalmed for days a sea, would whistle for the wind, a summons from a human windpipe to the most favorable of the 4 or 8 or 16 winds, an admirably pathetic fallacy. Wind to wind. So frequently did less favorable winds then rise and turn upon the ship that it became anathema to whistle for any reason aboard any sailing ship, lest a sailor whistle up a storm. The turnabout was evidently of such memorable vehemence that whistling even on the shore was itself held to put coastal communities in danger of flooding. Only those allied with banshees or desperate for revenge so that they minded no consequence would whistle on the shore. Whichever, whistling into the waves was wicked, and when something wicked this way came, it came, nautical odds were by way of whistling. Whistling then became premonitory, as in the Crimea on, yes, the 10th and 11th of November, 1853, when the whistling of winds across the waters of Balaclava preceded a gale so unexpected and powerful that it destroyed most of the English ships and supplies. Premonitory also for those who whistle past graveyards. Whistling, it is said, keeps up your courage in the lurking presence of ghosts or evil. You whistle to let the darker spirits know you are onto them, or better, that they matter not a whit. Keeping such a trajectory of whistling in mind, I am recalled persistently to these historical questions about emergency.
Hello and welcome to the Whistling Podcast. My name is Alphonse Bouzard. That was the voice of Hillel Schwartz from a lecture called Whistling Up a Storm Toward a History of Emergency. It can be found on YouTube as well as a few other of his lectures. Hillel Schwartz is quite an extraordinary scholar and has written books on topics such as the French prophets, millenniarism, copies, dieting, fat, and noise. The book that's next on the top of my reading list is entitled Making Noise, From Babel to the Big Bang and Beyond, from 2011, published by Zone Press. As I have said before, I live in China and it's not easy to get books in English. Promise you, Professor Schwartz, that your book is in the mail. I'm looking quite forward to reading it. While I wait the 2 to 3 months to receive it, I'll be able to read his book, The Culture of the Copy, Striking Likenesses, Unreasonable Facsimiles, from 1996. Luckily, that one's available to check out on the Internet Archives. Making Noise is 900 pages, all on the topic of the history of noise, and reviewers make note of the remarkable 349 pages of endnotes, which are downloadable separately. When people call Hillel Schwartz a scholar, they're not kidding. Even the bibliography and notes for this lecture that I'm about to read are 4 pages long, single-spaced. Hillel Schwartz is also a poet, and I feel a poetic rhythm in this lecture. There are a lot of nice little list poems, especially on the kinds of whistling covered and uncovered. More ideas for future podcasts. Since this is quite a long lecture, I will keep the commentary to a minimum. Let's get on with it. Whistling for the Hell of It by Hillel Schwartz.
There is movement, and therefore is sound. No motion, no movement, no sound. There is movement, and therefore is sound. No motion, no movement, no sound. Is movement, and therefore is sound. No motion, no movement, no sound. There is movement, and therefore is sound. No motion, no movement, no sound. There is movement, and therefore is sound. No motion, no movement, no sound.
If our eyes and optical systems are keyed to motion, to changes in position or color or intensity, and if the pupils of our eyes when scanning a face or reading a text are jumping from one fixed point to another in jerks called saccades, our ears can do nothing whatsoever without motion except collude in oral hallucination or spurious artifacts we call tinnitus, a noise in the ears. And if these optical saccades, initiated cortically by the frontal eye fields, FEF, or subcortically by the superior colliculus, build up a sampled three-dimensional map of what lies before the eyes at a pace almost blinding, with a peak angular speed of 900 degrees per second, faster than any other organ, they may also be an involuntary consequence of turning the head in response to a startling noise. For we are born with a startle reflex that is chiefly acoustic and registers motion as noise. More than touch or taste or smell or sight, sound is what primally alarms us. So primally that the moro or startle reflex can occur in utero. And, in the same moment, sound assures us that the cold world we enter upon birth is neither so cold as to be dead, nor so still as to be solipsistic. No motion out there, no vibrations, no bumping and grinding of particles, no waves, no sound waves, no sound, no us. Oh, we could have motion within, picked up by senses nominally absent from these Einstein Forum symposia, interoception, kineception, proprioception. By way of interoception, you may be made aware of, and come to listen in on, the sound of your internal motions, heartbeats, breath, wheezing, a pounding pulse at the neck or wrist, the throbbing of veins, the moaning of the spleen, flatus, farting, the borborygmus of the guts. If nothing out there is audibly alive, you here are. By way of kineception, you may be made aware of and come to listen in on the sound of yourself in motion through space, most patently your old self and the cracking of its joints, the swivel of its hips, the unfurling of wrinkled skin, the mashing of gums, facial tics, the effusiveness of saliva. By way of proprioception, you may be made aware of and come to listen in on motions of air or humid fog across the superstructure and follicles of your body, changes of pressure impinging on bone hollows and sacs of bodily fluid, solid presences millimeters distant but about to touch or momentarily collide like a bee about to bump the forehead of a bounding bicyclist, ghosts or spirits of a place, infrasonic or electromagnetic, attempting sly contact through a viscous ether. Sound cannot be about motion, whether impacted, imputed, or imagined. The motion of ourselves and others, whether it or you or they or that. More vehemently than the optic or haptic, the sonic constitutes who we are out in the world, quiet or riotous, helpful or hurtful, or ostensibly hermetic. Noise, problematizing sound, makes most pressing the social nature of the acoustic. Noise is never so much a question of the intensity of sounds as of the intensity of relationships between past and present, imagined or resurrected or immediately experienced, between one generation and the next, between country and city, between one class and another, between cultures or subcultures. Noise may be unwanted or incomprehensible or obtrusive sound. It is never insignificant sound, inflecting as it does our ambitions and crimes, our experiences of publicity and retirement, our practices of peace and torture and war, our allegories of apocalypse and paradise. Now that I have claimed so much for sound and for noise, you may wonder if I have so grounded and expounded sound as to make it wholly uninteresting. In a double-spoken commencement talk at MIT in 1999, Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers, auto mechanics and hosts of a popular public radio show about car problems, which they often diagnose from the engine sounds reported by callers, sought something inspirational to tell fellow MIT graduates as they headed out into the world to become wealthy, successful, or, as they were, just plain happy. Click and Clack, or Tom and Ray Magliozzi, displayed a chart that mapped intelligence vis-a-vis happiness. Right-brained people were consistently happier than calculating left-brained people. Golden retrievers happier than the most artistic of human masters. Worms happier than any golden retriever, but the ascendant line on the chart was reserved for grass. Grass is happiest because, presumably, unthinking. Such unthinking happiness may be impossible to sustain with every further estimate of global climate change. Stay off the grass, really. Tundra or savanna. It may be all we have left, but in the short meantime of this symposium, I will take to heart the Tappet brothers' resultant mantra.
There is a process for reaching nirvana, and we are going to give it to you now. It is this. You must repeat the mantra. And the mantra, which happens to be emblazoned on our flag, which stands here, none of you morons will be able to read it because it's in Latin.
It says, non impediti ratione cogitationis.
Which of course means unencumbered by the thought process.
If you repeat this mantra, the brothers assured the MIT grads, life slows down. Being unencumbered by the thought process allows you to identify and hear and see defining moments in your life, things that will change your life. I want to take this mantra to heart and by removing the H from one end and the T from the other, to ear. Indeed, as would any newly passionate convert to a cause, I hope to push the Tappet brothers' thesis one step further toward the absolute by making a case for attending to happily frivolous sounds as frivolous, our sonic fripperies, idle and, yes, inconsequential, given the bent of any nascent field to prove itself by unpacking the significance of what has been thought negligible or inaccessible. Practitioners of sound studies have demonstrated the import of the hitherto unheard or dismissed. We have traced the psychosocial entanglements of the scarcely sounded and obnoxiously pounded. We have essayed the political and ethical repercussions of the silenced and the raucous. Along the way, we have secured a new gravitas for coughs, titters, glitches, cries, whispers, sighs. The time seems ripe now to work the other way around, to accept on its own terms a willed but unassuming sound and any incidental rhymes. If with a straight face I can embrace an audible trifle without trying to exalt its status or assert its centrality, wouldn't that show off the maturity of sound studies as a discipline at ease in the stirrup? As an historian of noise, I have my ears set on whistling. Aimless whistling. Tuneful or tuneless or indeterminate. It seems a good sound to settle on because humans have whistled and made whistles and probably complained about whistling for 50 millennia or more. People need no costly accoutrements or education to whistle, so it is egalitarian, whiling its way from the downtrodden to the most recumbent of the wealthy. I must exclude from consideration all intentional whistling produced by people in their capacities as alarm designers, alarmists, eager birdwatchers, satirical clowns, avant-garde composers, dog owners, dolphin trainers, doormen hailing cabs, equestrians, falconers, folk singers, ghosts and their mediums, Harpo Marx imitators, hecklers, hunters, islanders with whistled languages, jingle riders, lookouts, minstrels, nuns otherwise confined to gesture, opera-goers, professional whistlers, sailors aboard ships becalmed, sheep herders with their dogs, sports fans, traffic cops, train men, wolves in men's or women's clothing. I must also bypass such involuntary whistlers as craniocarpal tarsal dysplasiacs, whistling face syndrome, obsessive compulsives, snorers, sufferers from behavioral variant frontotemporal disorder, tickers, and tracheotomized soldiers with bullet holes in their throats. I hew instead to an historical account of that voluntary, frivolous whistling insusceptible to and inexpressive of ambition, courage, courtship, musicality, pride, purpose. This leaves me with boys, demons, girls, mad people, murderers, philosophers, and stutterers, and odd conjuries, stutterers the oddest. Recognizing that stutterers and those with Parkinsonism may sing fluently when falling short of talk, therapists have encouraged them to whistle over obstacles and tremors. A masking and a taking flight, their whistling signals at once the suspension of articulate communication and a desire to resume. As a stopgap between halting phonemes and flowing phrases, it matters not what they whistle, only that they whistle. According to his mother in Chicago, such was the case with her 14-year-old son Emmett. who had been taught to manage his own stutter by whistling. One August day in 1955, while visiting relatives in Money, Mississippi, he had entered a shop. Asking for bubblegum but facing a problem with his bees, Emmett Till began whistling and was misheard as a black teen wolf whistling at the white woman who ran the grocery. 4 nights later, he was pistol-whipped, mutilated, shot, and drowned by her husband and Confederates. The instant I entered the aural labyrinth of Till's lynching, I should have known that willfulness and consequence are never far from our thoughts, that innocuousness lies uneasily with retrospect, and frivolity squirms in the arms of the modern, postmodern, pre-post-apocalyptic. Speaking of whistling and apocalypse, when Australian physicians in 1968 worried publicly about children choking on Japanese whistle candy, half-inch peppermint rings with slots to blow through, the Nixon Confectionery Company's boxes were pulled from grocery shelves as distant as Singapore. Nixon had meant to profit from youthful delight in the incidental synesthesia of shrill sweetness, no differently than Caractacus Potts and Truly Scrumptious singing the charms of Toot Sweet Candy in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, a film released that year, 1968, when French workers and students were literally whistling against the sour old order.
Toot, sweets, toot, sweets, a bonbon to blow on at last has been found. Toot, sweets, toot, sweets, with tweetable, eatable sound.
Alack! I'd hoped to sidestep momentousness with a human interest anecdote about candy, but cultural resonance has called me out, fingers in the mouth. And if not the synchronicity of near revolution whistled in the West, could confectioners in Japan have been oblivious to the affinity across East Asia of shrill whistling and ghosts? Had Nixon never heard whistling demons among the Oni, or issuing from the Usobuki masks of Kyogen? Comic interludes between no dramas, lips puckered, whistling up the spirits of unlikely dead, scarecrows, mosquitoes, demonic mushrooms? Thence to demons, whose whistling is rather an autocon of the demoniacal than an attempt, as by ghosts, at making themselves understood. Since whistling is rarely crucial to demonhood, I could claim that demonic whistling is trivial, epiphenomenal. But those who have been within earshot of demons whistling up a storm will scarcely believe me. Anyhow, why prevaricate? By most accounts, demons are inhuman. On the trail of idle human whistling, I should turn my back on demons. Ah, but that's what demonic whistling makes impossible. Whether you think that demons are human projections of personal fear or guilt, or transubstantiations of familial bad blood and collective anxieties, or robust beings shadowing our world for purposes retributive, entropic, or admonitory, whatever you think, their whistling cannot be ignored. If it has no meaning per se, it appears meant for us. So, although the older Kahar villagers, the younger streetwise generations, and British landowners take different tacks in dealing with the persistent, baffling whistling that pierces the darkness and the tangle of Hansuli Turn,
where the river doubles back on itself in a very tight curve,
they could not leave it alone. As the Indian novelist Bandyopadhyay made clear in the tale of Hansuli Turn, and likewise the Angolan novelist Anjaki in The Whistler, 2008, inexplicable whistling cannot mean nothing, no matter how cruel the twist of double negatives. So shamans from Peru to Natal whistle through intoxicant moistened lips or the punctuated bones of deer to link the present and prophetic, afflicted and ancestral, dispirited and Empyrean. Do you hear now how I am destined for failure? It would matter not a whit if a person were whistling idly or with malice aforethought. As with demons in the darkness, we are driven to make sense of acoustic turbulence, and the act of whistling is intrinsically obstreperous, phonologically obstruent, physically turbulent. Those who whistle under tense or tender situations are held to be whistling for help, as surely as they are whistling up an acoustic isolation chamber or securing safety through stimming, the autism community's shorthand for repetitive self-stimulation. The whistling of those who have lost their handle on words or gone frustratingly unheard must be at once a symptom of unreason or neurological disorder, and an heroic effort at self-expression when all else lexical is in the grip of private demons. Sigmund Freud, though alert to his analysand's hemmings and hawings, hoarseness and coughing, was no analyst of obstruents. If physicians in training at Zurich's, devoutly Freudian, Clinic of Psychiatry before World War I
had to explain why we whistled or hummed some particular tune,
their explanations could neither be idle nor biochemical. Freud's own whistling, even only, on holiday in the mountains, was far from frivolous. With a silver whistle, he piped his children to come marvel at mushrooms. Far from frivolous, too, was a Balka installation for the Freud Museum in the London house where Freud spent his last year, 1939, accompanied by a recording of someone whistling almost inaudibly the theme from the 1963 film The Great Escape, ghostly reminder that 4 of Freud's sisters, who had remained behind in Austria, would perish in death camps. Aside from compounding contradictions in Freud's life and shortcomings in analytic foresight, Balka's work compounded the contradictions in whistling that have been driving my inquiry to its doom. However superficial or barely audible the act of whistling, it cannot be so frivolous as to slip the potent knot of illusion. That, you might say, is the human condition. But then how did I get myself into such hot water that whistling for the hell of it would be metonymic of no less than the human condition? Donald Winnicott would have sympathized. He who impressed upon psychoanalytic circles the value of sheer play for children and grown-ups had himself an adult habit of whistling for the hell of it. When his colleague Marion Milner arrived for a colloquy,
he would open the door and then be all over the place, whistling, forgetting something, running upstairs, a general sort of platter,
until he settled down to work with
fiery flashes of intuition.
This pattern he elevated to method, proposing that analysts allow for
phrases of nonsense, when no thread ought to be searched for in a patient's material, because what is going on is preliminary chaos, the first phase of the creative process.
Woo! Here at last is someone authoritative personally and professionally welcoming whistling mayhem and bravely willing to hear nonsense qua nonsense. I have only to accept that whistling for the hell of it could be the run-up to an energized creativity. Problem solved. How brief the hallelujah! My historian's hackles stiffen. The vaunting of play and playful whistling as prelude to insight or renewed work, does this not hearken back to romantic celebrations of carefree boyhood? Listen to the country editor of New York City's Independent, tickled in 1912 with an illustration of a whistling boy for
"Nowhere is perfect satisfaction so completely expressed as in the whistling boy."
It happened this morning, as the country editor laid down the vacation number for the dozenth time, and his ear was filled with the choral daybreak song of the robins, that he heard far down in the valley another boy whistling. Or was it the same boy? It might have been a lad that was filled with glory of daybreak, and was trying to chime in with the robins. It might have been a lad who had risen early, because the fish will bite best at dawn. One thing about it, the whistler in the valley was intensely happy, and he was in full key with nature. Everything was happy, and everybody was happy, and so was the editor.
Was there
any other way for a boy to let his soul fly right off unrestrained?
Any way? Any boy? Anywhere? for whistling was
one of the universals, and it is done in the same way all the world around.
Wherefore,
encourage whistling. It is the natural language of youth. He should not disturb the household, but out of doors he should be allowed to put on steam, for that is just what whistling means.
Herbert Spencer had thought the same. Protesting Darwin's oversexed explanation of birdsong, Spencer, the social Darwinist, wrote an 1891 postscript to his 1857 essay on the origin of music.
What then is the true interpretation? Simply that, like the whistling and humming of tunes by boys and men, the singing of birds results from overflow of energy.
Overflow of sexual energy could be, as in a 17th century anecdote of
a boy that whistled incomparably well,
who
waited on a lady, a widow, of good fortune. Every night this boy was to whistle his lady asleep. At last she could hold out no longer, but bids her chambermaid withdraw, bids him come to bed, sets him to work, and marries him the next day. This is certain true.
But for Spencer and other less randy Victorians, whistling could be mere youthful intensity. Take, for example, James Clerk Maxwell, a man of boyish enthusiasms whose thermodynamic equations transformed the calculus of energy.
When thinking out a problem, he had a habit of whistling, not loudly, but in a half-subdued manner, no particular tune discernible, but a sort of running accompaniment to his inward thoughts.
Could be, too, that whistling was sheer outward exuberance, as that of
a flaxen-headed cowboy, as simple as may be, and next merry ploughboy.
Who, quoth Charles Dickens, 1873, from a 1787 song by William Shield,
whistled overly, because he liked it, and that's enough.
Whistling logic was as happily vocal as it was virtuosic. If, as a whistling enthusiast claimed in 1910, whistling was
quite as perfect and natural an instrument
as the voice, exceeding its ordinary compass by almost an octave, and if good whistlers could
perform harder music with more ease and less practice,
then the subtlest whistling through the purest of throats might afford a certain true universal communion. Such has been the logic of Gnostic magicians in the Hellenistic West and of Taoist philosophers' poets in medieval China, who composed lyrical tractates on the supernal power of whistling masters to convene the elements or balance the forces of the cosmos. It would never be enough for a boy to whistle o'er the lea because he liked it. He must bear on his thin shoulders centuries of cosmic harmonizing. Little of this happy iconosonography holds for the second sex. It was not Simone de Beauvoir, but Sartre who wrote of himself to her at the first pucker of romance in 1926.
Alas, you are always ready to give your love. It's the easiest thing to get from you. I'm not talking about your love for me, which is well beyond that, but you are lavish with little secondary loves, like that night in Thavers, when you loved that peasant walking downhill in the dark, whistling away, who turned out to be me.
He had been whistling because he was asthmatic, in French a whistler,
un siffleur,
or because as a young man a whistling, Sartre could play an innocent rustic fully attuned to the cosmos. Peasant or princess, a woman whistling away would almost invariably have been heard whistling herself toward hell. As it was said,
whistling girls and crowing hens never come to no good end.
By the 1920s, young de Beauvoir may have heard exceptions. In the flesh, the professional whistler Alice Shaw, La Belle Siffleuse. In fiction, the nightwalker Satin in Zola's Nana of 1880. In verse, David Nimmo's 1908 defense of The Whistling Girl as creative, thoughtful, independent.
Oh, the whistling girl is the girl for me. So happy, so bright and so charmingly free. With her heart most full and in overflow. Like a crystal stream where the winds at blow. A heart that is full of delirious life will unfold itself in harmonious strife. Be a strange combine of a girl and a boy, and them both at once in their wildest joy.
Notice, only as an hermaphrodite could a whistling girl be free. A woman whistling in public made bright, then delirious, then wild that which men most feared, with lips protuberant, witch's curse, with fingers in a widened mouth, succubus. One can hear this fear in the career of the basilisk, who since Roman times has undergone a sex change from male to female, added wings to its slithering body, and had its deadly hiss translated to a fatal bird-like whistling. If women have shaken loose from the mythic, their sibilance cannot be so careless. It pulses yet with sounds of strife, hell-bent against gender-corseted lives. Read across bookstore shelves, for example, the scores of current titles in which whistling women claim the covers of fictions and non-fictions of lesbianism, of activism, of arguments for the courage of convictions and dignity of person.
It's harder for a woman,
says Frederica near the end of A.S. Bayet's A Whistling Woman, 2002.
And so,
says her partner Luck,
you must just whistle harder, louder.
Aimless, idle? Not by happenstance does Bayet's novel open on a dark fantasy of bird women called whistlers, hissing, whistling like basilisks in mortal pursuit. Now I am left with murderers and philosophers. Murderers I have targeted because of the remarkable number of nonchalant whistlers in murder mysteries and westerns. Did these not bespeak a similar prevalence on the mean streets of the Real? Well, no. I can find the occasional accused murderer whistling in courtrooms and convicts whistling in jail, but only one instance of a whistling killer on the streets of Gary, Indiana in 1927, who approached each of his victims from the rear whistling and singing. Witnesses did not say whether the killer was whistling to distract or disarm them, or nervously, compulsively, idly, intently. Was nonchalant whistling purely a literary device to persuade readers and viewers of a murderer's heartlessness or sociopathy? Then I came upon accounts by Auschwitz inmates who recalled Joseph Mengele's continual whistling of Puccini airs while at his murderous clinic or on his platform by the boxcars, directing new arrivals toward gas chambers or more tortuous death. Nonchalant this whistling, or obsessive or demonic, but inconsequential? How could the monstrous, the manticore say with its 3 ranks of teeth and lion's body, whistling as it lashes its scorpion tail, ever be inconsequential? No less consequential, surely, than the whistling of prisoners at Auschwitz, sometimes under their breath, to keep up their spirits or conspire sub rosa. I could not be unmoved by sounds of whistling on either side of the barbed wire. I could not wax philosophical about idle, whistling as evidence of some utter divorce between impulses, creative and destructive, some categorical distinction between aesthetics and mass murder. What of philosophers then? One day in the 4th century BCE, when Diogenes the Cynic
was gravely discoursing, and nobody attended to him, he began whistling, and as people clustered about him, he reproached them with coming, in all seriousness, to hear nonsense, but slowly and contemptuously, when the theme was serious.
Although the cynic's whistling was rather sly than aimless, thereafter Western philosophers favored whistling as a prime exemplar of thoughtless action. I need not cite whistling exemplars down through the ages, for we have before us a most exemplary exemplar involving the philosopher whom 444 other philosophers in 1999 voted the most influential of the 20th century. A gifted whistler was he, Ludwig Wittgenstein, capable of Schubert Lieder, viola parts from string quartets, or the second movement of Beethoven's Seventh, which is what he whistled atop a gun carriage as an Austrian artillery officer at the end of the Great War, and whose phrasing he discussed with Maurice Drury in 1930. Years later, laboring over his philosophical investigations, he told his friend, "It is impossible to say in my book one word about all that music has meant in my life," adding, "How then can I hope to be understood?" Therein lay the nub. His initial reputation stemmed from his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1922, composed under bombardment in the trenches, which arrived at a last line as startling as shell shock.
Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent.
Silent he was as a philosopher in the decade after the war, until accepting a fellowship in 1929 at Cambridge University, where he began rethinking. It was his young advisor, Frank P. Ramsey, who that year referred to the Tractatus in an essay, writing that,
"What can't be said, and it can't be whistled either."
If philosophers have debated at length the implications of whereof one cannot speak, they have erected full-blown schools of interpretation in re, it can't be whistled either. All agree that Ramsey was alluding to Wittgenstein's skill at whistling. But did he mean that Wittgenstein had been hoping in vain to whistle around what he could not state directly? Or that any attempt to show, e.g. by nonsensical sound, rather than say, a distinction avowed by the early Wittgenstein, possibly disavowed later, was more musical-mystical than logical? Or that the worth of his work, extending to 250,000 words of unpublished lectures and book notes, was methodological? A heedful stammering and styling that expressed his sense of philosophers as monitors of the words we use, not arbiters of truth. Wittgenstein's own use of whistling as exemplar was nestled between wordlessness and the world, heralding a pragmatic, if contingent, relation between self and other.
A whistle, and someone asks me why I am so cheerful. I reply, I'm hoping N will come today. But while I whistled I wasn't thinking of him. All the same, it would be wrong to say I stopped hoping when I began to whistle.
Neither waiting nor hoping was subsumed by whistling, but like hoping, whistling bridged time, asserted presence and continuity, the more insistently that Wittgenstein, disciples, and critics adduced whistling as an exemplar of the unthinking, the more effectively it prompted discussions of meaning and nonsense, of the enduring and ephemeral, of the heft of language as an anchor of the human. Whistling for the hell of it was no mean thing. Thus collapses my project, an utter failure, because I have failed to honor the nature of utterance. Idle whistling is never failed utterance, but utterance flat out. As the neurologist Oliver Sacks has written regarding those with global aphasia, utterance is
an uttering forth of one's whole meaning with one's whole being, the understanding of which involves infinitely more than mere word recognition.
This was how Wittgenstein listened to music, drawing breath, shutting his eyes and gathering his brows, and drawing down his chin with mouth closed, just as if he were savoring something exquisite. It is how, in Elizabeth Partridge's picture book, Whistling, a child and his father out in the woods in the hours before dawn practice at small turbulences of air, the grass of the forest floor under their feet, wet and dark and happy, until they whistle up the sun. When our sun goes kaput and hell freezes over during the super cold super millennia of the sun's dying, odds are that a Bose-Einstein condensate of superfluid helium-4 may chance to oscillate back and forth through an array of superfine pores in some not implausible substance on one of the forsaken planetary bodies orbiting at or below a temperature of 2 Kelvin, producing a quantum whistle that none of us and nothing but bosons and quarks will be around to register. That whistling may be truly frivolous. The end.
Call action. A call to action. Call action. Call to action.
A call to action.
A call to action. A call to action.
You can join the Whistling Podcast group on Facebook. I now have a website, thewhistlingpodcast.com. You can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/The Whistling Podcast. And I also have a Quora site for discussions, thewhistlingpodcastspace.quora.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time on The Whistling Podcast.